Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to talk about the data analysis plan, which goes at the very end of your method section. In the first video I posted, I talked about the bigger sections or bigger parts of your method section, such as the participants, materials, and procedure. In this video, I'm focused solely on the data analysis plan. So let's get into this one. You first might be wondering, what's the purpose of the data analysis plan, or why do you even need to write one? Well, the overall purpose here is to convince the reader that you have the knowledge and the skills of what to do with the data once you have it, right? Because before, in the other sections, you talked about, how you're going to collect the data and even what data you're going to have. But here you need to talk to the reader about, once I have that data, this is what I'm going to do with it, okay? So it's your message to the reader that you are an appropriate researcher. You have the appropriate skills to, number one, you can recognize the right test to use, the right statistical test to use. And number two, you know how to use it, right? So it's your clear articulation of your plan. So to write this, you start with a level 2 heading, and you can either call it data analysis or data analysis plan. And one thing to note is that this is a pretty short section. You're looking at about a paragraph, probably 4 sentences or something around there. If you're writing, longer than that, you're probably including the wrong information, because this is a very brief section. And again, just to kind of reiterate the point of it, you're providing the roadmap of your data, your proposed analyses of what you're going to do with the data. So to begin this section after the heading, I would probably remind the reader of the data that you're going to have first, okay? So to do this, the first sentence I would have here would probably be a reminder of the overall purpose of the study. So the purpose of the study was blankety blank, or this study tested the effects of blankety blank, okay? The next sentence that follows that, I would describe or restate the independent variables and then the dependent variables. So conveying that, two groups were compared on overall academic performance, and academic performance was measured by SAT or ACT, something like that. The last part of this here, this last bullet point here, is now we're going to get into, all right, we told the reader what data we have, but now we need to get into what we're going to do with the data and then what order we're going to do it in, okay? So some of you have an independent sample t-test. Some of you have a dependent sample t-test, and some of you have an ANOVA. So I'll describe what to do with each of those right here. So if you're doing an independent sample t-test, this is the situation where you have two groups that you're comparing. You should clearly state the data that you are comparing. So what I mean by that is an error that students often make is they say something really brief, such as an independent sample t-test will be used to compare the two groups, right? So that's a little vague, right? What I want to see is your articulation a little bit further, a little more clearly or explicitly of what will be compared. So for example, it's probably the case where you're comparing those two groups on a pre-test and a post-test. And this is an important point to make, because you're trying to convey to the reader that you know what you're doing with this data analysis, right? So it's really important to compare the two groups both at the beginning of the study and at the end of the study. Because if you don't compare the two groups at the beginning, then you really don't know if the two groups were different at the very beginning of the study. It's possible that one class was particularly bright and another class wasn't, and then that could have a big contributing factor of why one did better than the other on the test scores, right? So it's really important for you to know to the reader, hey, I'm going to use an independent sample t-test to compare the two groups in the pre-test and the post-test. So you're comparing both times there. So that's an important point to make, okay? And the dependent sample t-test is kind of the same idea. The only difference is you need to clearly articulate the different test times that are going to be compared with the in this case, one group, right? Some of you might have only 2 test times. Others might have 3, right? Let's say a standardized test might be delivered 3 times a year, so you want to compare those 3 different times. Others might even have more than that. You might have, 5 or 6 or even more test times. So you want to be clear in telling the reader what specific test times will be compared and how they're going to be compared. In this case, a dependent sample t-test. Okay. Last thing to note is the ANOVA. If you're using an ANOVA, you have more than 2 groups. So that's the beauty of the ANOVA. It allows you to compare 3 or more groups at the same time on one dependent variable. In this example, it is SAT scores, and you're going to compare groups 1, 2, and 3 on SAT scores. So that's a main effect. You have a factor, which is group, made up of 3 different levels, 1, 2, 3, right? And you're comparing that on one main dependent variable, right? So this is a main effect. So in this case, you would describe that first. Then you describe what you're going to do with the data with regard to interaction effects. So main effects come first, then interaction effects. So what's an interaction effect? So in this case, we have this factor would be group. Another factor would be gender. So this factor has 3 levels. The group has 3 levels. There's 1, 2, and 3 groups. This factor, gender, has 2 different levels, male and female. So in this case, you want to compare students' SAT scores based on group and gender at the same time. So you want to see if it made a difference if you were male or female in either of these 3 groups on that one dependent variable. So this is an interaction effect. So you want to describe main effects first, then interaction effects. Okay, to end this section, you could restate your prediction. So you could restate, what your hypotheses or hypotheses were regarding the data analysis plan that you just laid out. You don't have to do the hypothesis or prediction at the end, but most people do, and you can if you want to. But the most important points is the stuff that came up before, which is, the statistical test you're going to use. Okay, so that really concludes this video on how to write the data analysis plan. If you have any questions on this, please ask your instructor.